Now in this video we're going to look at how you can strengthen your recall and be able to remember anything for as long as you want to. In another video we explained how our memory works and that we have different types of memory. We have our sensory memory, our short-term memory, and of course our long-term memory. I mentioned then the challenge we face is how do we bridge the gap between our short-term memory and our long-term memory. Of course, one way to get a foothold into our long-term memory is to use a variety of memory techniques. Regardless of which technique you use, there is a secret to the best ones, which is you use your imagination to make something outstanding, you associate it to something you already know, and then strengthen the recall until you are always able to remember it. What we will do in this video is look at how you can strengthen your recall. So let's first look at what happens to information after you learn it. It follows a trace that looks like this. Your ability to recall actually rises for about 10 minutes or so until it reaches a peak. This increase is where your subconscious is integrating your new knowledge with your existing knowledge. This explains a situation where, after having a conversation with someone, you realize there is something else you should have said to them, but it only occurs to you later. Then, after reaching this peak, your ability to recall rapidly drops so that within 24 to 48 hours, you are likely to only be able to recall just 20% or even less of what you've learned. So why does this decline happen? Well, when you learn something, all you are doing in the brain is connecting brain cells together. So a new piece of information you learn is stored in the brain as a connection between two or more brain cells. Now in the moment you learn it, and whilst it's still fresh, it is easy to recall. But what happens though is we never learn facts in isolation, and as other knowledge is experienced, the original fact becomes confused by all this other information, and so becomes harder and harder to access and recall. This is why when you are revising for your exams and start studying information you were taught weeks or even months ago, that it feels like you've never ever covered it before. So what can you do? Well, there is a secret to the way brain cells connect, very familiar to neuroscientists, but largely unknown by the rest of the population, and certainly one most students are ignorant of. And that is that brain cells that fire together wire together. What this means is if you repeat and rehearse information, every time you do so, the neural connection will be stronger. It will therefore last longer and be easier to recall. The reverse of that is also true. If you ignore and neglect a memory, then the neural connections will weaken and therefore be harder to recall. It is important to understand this. Learning is the creation of new neural connections. Memory is the maintenance and strengthening of those connections. Experiencing something once is not going to be sufficient to help you transfer it into your long-term memory for you to be able to recall it whenever you want. To do that will require some effort and some repeated rehearsal. Now, you've already seen this diagram, which is what happens to your ability to recall something after you've learnt it. And you know that after 10 minutes, when it peaks, it will drop off very quickly. Well, what do you think might happen if you reviewed what you have learnt in that 10-minute point? Well, you'd get a similar curve, only with a new peak after a day, with more residual information left than was before. If you review that information again at the new peak, once again you get another peak. Only this time it will be after a week. If you review it again at the peak before it drops off, you get another peak. Only this time the peak of recall is after a month. And similarly, another review at this point will create another peak at 3 months. Every time you review the information at its peak, you strengthen it in your memory. There will be a degree of fading each time, but this will lessen the more you review and the more residual information trace is left behind until eventually it's in your long-term memory for you to recall at will. The most important thing to notice is that new information is at its most fragile in the first week of you learning it. And so this is where you should focus your efforts if you want to put something into your long-term memory. Now, before we get any further, let's get one thing straight. When I talk about reviewing information, I don't mean multiple repetition. If all you do is read something over and over again, two things happen. Number one, you will get bored. Number two, if you haven't fallen asleep, you will confuse the familiarity of what you keep seeing with thinking you know it when you don't. All you have done is got good at recognizing it. So what you need are multiple rehearsals, and that means practicing recalling what you've learnt from memory multiple times, especially as we have seen in the first week after you learn it. So instead of expending all your effort putting it into your memory, take it in once and then spend more time recalling it from memory. So here are 3 very effective and very powerful ways you can do that. Number 1, use mind maps to summarize your notes and then regularly recreate them from memory. Number 2, create a bank of question cards, a question on one side and the answer on the other, and then regularly test yourself using these cards. Number 3, teach others what you know. You will find having to express your understanding of the topic so others can understand it too will deepen your recall of it. So, will you get everything right every time you practice recalling from memory? Well, no, certainly not in the beginning. But the more you practice, the better you will get as you strengthen the memory in your brain. It will feel a little uncomfortable at first, and as long as you learn from and correct your errors of recall, then very quickly you will have a very strong memory of what you're learning.